this morning's Psyfeld discussion on the Maestro. So I'm going to ask the students to please enable their video so we can discuss the Seinfeld episode. To start out, just any observations on any particular character, scene, or anything that you found interesting, funny, or would care to discuss. So who do you want to talk about?
I can start in regards to something I noticed with this episode particularly, but I guess also a theme of Seinfeld, is the prevalence of, I guess, fixated thought processes with all the characters. George was really into having the security guards in the chair. Jerry was really interested in this house in Tuscany, even though he didn't have any intention of going through with renting it. He just wanted to know, is there a house I can rent, just because the Maestro proposed that he can essentially do that. So I just thought that was something interesting to notice that this episode, specifically with all the different plot lines, there's a lot of fixation going on.
Right. And I think with regard to really either character, one of the first things to consider is whether or not your observation is clinically significant. And operationally, the clinician has to consider whether or not it somehow impairs functioning, interpersonal, vocational, educational, etc. So from that perspective, any field, now I know we actually process this in the patient interview. We could actually ask this question directly to our patients. But with regard to the television show, your observation, do you feel that there was some clinical significance in the observed obsession with having a house in Tuscany or any of the other things that you observed?
Well, at least with George's plot line, I guess there was no impairment towards him. It caused impairment for the security guard at the end since the store got robbed. But I guess clinically, that's not something that applies to George directly. Jerry, with the house in Tuscany, I guess since he went through it with it in the end, I'm not sure if we can say it was impairment that he ended up spending a lot of money to rent the house in Tuscany, whether or not it was due to external pressure or due to wanting to see it through. So I guess in that regard, it did affect his life in some sort of way that now he's, what was it, 4 million poorer than he was before?
Yeah, I think, again, revisiting the idea that we, as psychiatrists, as doctors, have to talk to the patients we care for. I think it's fair to assume that we are going to inquire this of Jerry. So, was it worth your trip? Did you enjoy your trip? Now that it's over, how did things go? How do you feel? Hypothetically, if Jerry said, with regard to what I experienced, the investment was certainly worth it. And we then concluded that there was no clinical significance. On the other hand, for George, even though there's no impairment for him, impairment in psychiatry is both towards self and others. And if a security guard lost his job as a result of George's behavior, to the extent that that information would be communicated to the clinician, we could actually say that it reached that threshold of clinical significance. So I think for George, we should proceed as if there was some impairment in vocational functioning, certainly from the perspective of the character of the security guard. And in Jerry's hypothetical case, let's just say that he thought the trip was wonderful and it certainly was worth the investment. In Jerry's case, with regard to this focused thought, one clinical term that we often use is the overvalued idea. The overvalued idea is the deficit in thought content that arbitrarily we believe is not clinically significant. So perhaps Jerry's character might identify or demonstrate the overvalued idea. George, on the other hand, if we are to say that it is clinically significant, would have his deficit in thought content otherwise described by one of several terms. And in this case, I would like students to put them in two groups. The first group is a group that is clinical significant, but is not psychotic. The second group is one that is clinically significant, and is psychotic. The first group would go by the names or clinical terms of rumination, preoccupation, and obsession. And for the most part, for all intents and purposes, clinicians tend to use those terms interchangeably, right? Because all of them are kind of an intermediate form of thought content deficit, specifically that, unlike the overvalued idea, they are clinically significant, but unlike the delusion, they are not psychotic. That, of course, brings us to that final category, the category that identifies that deficit of thought content as both clinically significant and psychotic, where the individual not only has this thought that is not reality-based, but it is also rigid. That is, when presented with evidence to the contrary, their thought deficit persists. And then that identifies psychosis in general. And when we focus on areas of thought content, delusion in particular, right? So I think through the interaction of these best friends, with regard to what the episode The Maestro demonstrates, we actually can review a part of the mental status exam labeled or titled thought or thought content, and from there arrive at these different clinical terms. And through Jerry Seinfeld and George Costanza, now understand the progression from the overvalued idea, the rumination, preoccupation, obsession, and then finally the delusion. Okay. What might result in an individual waking up one Friday morning around 8 o'clock with an overvalued idea, and then by 4 o'clock becoming delusional? Any thoughts, pardon the pun, on what might lead to that progression? We think biopsychosocially. From a biological perspective, it will be some deficit in the frontal cortex, whatever that might be. So if you want to keep it neurobiological, specifically bio with regard to the biopsychosocial model, something may be impairing the frontal cortex. In terms of a psychosocial perspective, stress is an easy example. And of course, these are not mutually exclusive, in as much as stress can impair frontal or frontocortical functioning. All right, so keep that in mind as well. Again, pardon the pun, with regard to how one may evolve from having an overvalued idea that is not even clinically significant to becoming delusional and having it impair their functioning. With regard to these characters, Jerry and George, any other observations made beyond what we discussed? How about other characters in Seinfeld's episode, The Maestro? What else did you see that you found interesting?
I found it interesting that the Maestro character himself insisted on everyone calling him that. And to me, if someone in my social circle or anyone around me kind of had a habit like that, it would definitely be picked up as odd, bizarre, which I think it was. But in the end, I forget what the woman's name is, but she's totally okay with it. She just goes along with it. At first, there's a little bit of trepidation, but she kind of just runs with it. And I think by the end, the only one who still has an issue with it is Jerry. So I think that might fall, his insistence on being called Maestro might fall into the category of, it's somewhat of an obsession that he has, that character, with being called that, but it's not to the point where it's inhibiting his life in any way, because no one really seems to mind it in the end.
Right, yeah. Again, we certainly would want to take a patient history for any evidence of clinical significance. But beyond that, what I find interesting with the Maestro character is that he kind of piggybacks George here, even though the real focus with regard to the group dynamic is between him, Elaine, and Jerry, and perhaps even Kramer. The proverbial odd man out, George, I think from a clinical perspective, is the one really related here, because we just discussed George Costanza to introduce this idea of progression, of deficit within thought content. And to the extent that George's deficit was clinically significant, then we have this idea of an obsession versus a rumination versus a preoccupation, right? One of those intermediate severity forms of deficit in thought content. And again, from a clinical perspective, whatever one of these three terms the clinician uses is usually interchangeable. That said, we also introduced when things cross the line, they remain clinically significant, but are now part of a psychotic process. And then clinicians often use the term to describe that process as a delusion. And when individuals have these fixed beliefs that remain intact despite evidence to the contrary, they are often referred to as being psychotic. Psychotic, again, here operationalized or defined through the individual's thought content not being reality-based. And when we reach this part of the process, when we reach this part of progression, there are usually 5 themes that we can kind of look at as subtypes, if you will, of delusion. Matter of fact, in the fullest blown case, and I'm not saying that George necessarily is going to be diagnosed here, but in the fullest blown case, we refer to this as delusional disorder. And when we do reach that diagnosis, there are 5 subtypes of delusional disorder. That is, we carry these themes and create specific subtypes for their disorder, referred to or defined as delusional disorder. Again, delusional disorder is an individual who presents with one or more fixed beliefs that impair functioning and cannot have their beliefs described or accounted for by a larger illness such as schizophrenia. Right? So that's the general definition of delusional disorder. One of the ways in which clinicians may be assisted in separating out delusional disorder from perhaps new onset schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder is that except for the impact of the delusion itself, the individual's functioning otherwise appears to remain intact. And that simply is not the case in schizophrenia. So as a clinical pearl, and really part of the definition, that's one of the things we look for with regard to the impact or clinical significance of the delusion. It is clinically significant, but beyond that of the impact of the delusion itself, the individual's functioning otherwise appears to remain intact. So let's talk a little bit about these subtypes of delusional disorder, or if you want to pull back a little bit, just the more common themes of delusions in particular. Any thoughts about, again, part of the fun, any ideas about what these themes are? There are 5.
Before we move on, can I ask a question about
of course.
Functionality? So it seems like the distinction between delusional disorder and schizophrenia is functionality. Can we just, what exactly are the parameters of functionality? Is it bathing every day or at least on some sort of regular schedule? Is it going to work? Is it sleeping enough? Or what exactly are the parameters there?
Well, what we do is we look a little bit less on specific examples because we still have to get to the bottom line. Even if hygiene happens to be one, we have to ask why. If the individual is not taking a shower because they believe that their life would be in danger because of blank as a result of their delusion, then it may be delusional disorder, but it also may be schizophrenia. So the real idea here and the real difficulty, the difficult task for the clinician is to tease out why. The better example would be the origins of this clinical term of schizophrenia. Recall that it was initially described as dementia praecox. Individuals afflicted with this illness appear to have dementia, but at a very early onset, right? Instead of onset older than the age of 60, individuals 18 to 25 looked like they had, quote unquote, pre-senile dementia. I mean, that's praecox, early onset. And that means that even though the DSM misses this in 2020, one of the things that was really a focus of clinical attention upon the discovery of this illness was the fact that individuals had severe cognitive deficits. And as such, those cognitive deficits would impair functioning. Individuals would drop out of school. Okay, they would become jobless. They would become homeless because of those cognitive deficits. That happens in schizophrenia. There's a downward drift with regard to afflicted individuals with regard to schizophrenia. That tends not to happen with delusional disorder. In delusional disorder, the individual still may not take a shower, but it has nothing to do with cognitive deficits. It has everything to do with the actual fixed belief that if they did, blank would happen. So that's where you have to tease away the larger disorder like schizophrenia, schizoaffective, that may contain delusions versus the disorder that is defined more simply through clinically significant delusion or delusions of multiple types, that is, multiple subtypes. Right? Does that make more sense?
Yeah, it seems like more kind of like a over Gestalt view, a 30,000-foot view, looking at the two disorders, trying to distinguish the two.
Right. Don't forget the cognitive deficits. If you look at the definition in the DSM of schizophrenia or even schizoaffective disorder, you don't see cognitive deficits there, right? But that was the initial description of this illness, dementia praecox, and there are cognitive deficits very pervasive in the condition. And if an individual's clinical significance is due to those, it is not delusional disorder, right? It's one of the easier ways to differentiate A from B. So getting back to the question, what are the 5 common themes of delusions? What are the 5 subtypes of delusional disorder? So the acronym is JPEGs, right? So individuals with delusional disorder may have jealous type. They may have persecutory type, erotomanic type, grandiose, and then finally somatic, right? JPEGs. Those are the 5 subtypes of delusional disorder. Those are the 5 themes of delusion that we'll often talk about. In the Maestro's case, I think we're looking at grandiose type, right? And what's interesting is that if you select 5 episodes of Seinfeld, 5 of Elaine's boyfriends / acquaintances actually demonstrate these separate themes, with the Maestro being the example of the grandiose subtype. I'm not going to get into Elaine's 4 other boyfriends and cover jealous, persecutory, erotomanic, and somatic, but we actually published an article on that. I will post that link on my Twitter page. So not to take any time up this morning, Elaine Bennis does have 5 ex-boyfriends, each demonstrating qualities of these subtypes of delusional, that is the subtypes of delusional disorder. So grandiose. Now, there's another trick here, and that is one of the things that I hope as early as your clerkship you really truly appreciate, and that is people tend not to read the textbook before presenting to clinical practice, right? So individuals may actually have a delusion with or without overriding schizophrenia that don't neatly fit into one of these artificial categories. And as such, we will define them through the DSM as having an undifferentiated subtype. Okay. The other type, that is the other subtype, would be mixed. Again, not fitting in any one category means that you might fit in none of the above, undifferentiated, or you may fit into more than one, mixed subtype. I think for mixed subtype, Stephen King's Annie Wilkes of Misery fits there. She not only demonstrates aspects of erotomania, which, by the way, if you've watched Misery or read the novel, is clinically significant, but there is also a grandiose subtype as well. So she has a mixed subtype. She does talk to Paul Sheldon about speaking directly to God and understanding her role and why Paul Sheldon got into that auto accident that day. So mixed, both erotomanic and grandiose. That's Annie Wilkes. That's Stephen King's Misery. Undifferentiated subtype. These subtypes do appear on shelf exams, so they're important to know, and there are 3 common ones that you may be responsible for identifying in a case vignette about 4 weeks from now. These 3 illnesses actually take the name of the psychiatrist or neurologist that initially discovered them. So anybody have any guesses as to what these three undifferentiated forms of delusional disorder are named? So what is the Capgras or Capgras syndrome? Capgras or Capgras is a syndrome, delusional syndrome, in which an individual believes that someone close to them, it's usually their spouse, it's usually their domestic partner, has been replaced by an imposter. All right, so the idea of a body snatcher syndrome. Individuals afflicted with this illness in clinical practice, perhaps a case vignette, may paint the picture that that individual refuses to sign an informed consent to allow you to speak to a family member because that's not who they say themselves to be. They're an alien that has taken over. Right. So basically, if you've watched any alien film, including Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it would be a metaphor for the Capgras syndrome. The second syndrome is the Fregoli syndrome, which is a variant of Capgras. The Fregoli syndrome is the belief that an individual is able to shapeshift and take the form of others. This is a syndrome that looks at the process in clinical terms, intermetamorphosis. It is the shapeshifter syndrome. For those of you who have watched The Matrix, Neo, or really more importantly, Morpheus's delusional belief that the agents can take any form certainly demonstrates the Fregoli syndrome. And the final syndrome that students may find on exams is referred to as Cotard. Cotard is the delusional belief that the individual is dead. That is the Walking Dead syndrome, or that some aspect of themselves, their heart, their intestines, is dead or dying. All right, so that's the Cotard syndrome. For those of you who have seen M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, the main character there, spoiler alert, might be afflicted with the Cotard syndrome. So those are the three syndromes that carry on the specific titles in the undifferentiated type of delusional disorder. All right, so that's Maestro. Any other observations with regard to Elaine, the Maestro, or the link between Elaine and the Maestro? Any other characters or behaviors you'd like to discuss this morning? Any other observations? We're talking about the Maestro episode of Seinfeld.
I'm not sure if this also under the category of psychological disorder, but would you characterize Kramer's behavior as malingering?
Malingering, right. So for those who perhaps were unable to watch the episode, can you give us a little bit of detail about the behavior you observed?
Yeah, so I believe Kramer spilled hot coffee on himself and then got a burn, and his idea was to see a lawyer to sue the coffee company for producing coffee that was too hot. And he found a lawyer who went along with his idea, and midway through the episode, I think the Maestro gave him an ointment that healed his burn, which kind of ruined his chances at, winning the lawsuit against the coffee company.
Yep. So in the legal field, they are not likely to use the term malingering, but I think when you look at this from a clinical perspective as a physician, I think malingering would be the single best diagnosis, where an individual perhaps would use the word enhance, manipulate their burns for specific gain. Right? Gain is another way of referring to motivation. So from this perspective, what I would like to do is briefly discuss a group of disorders that, again, are common in clinical practice, especially on a consult service, and also are likely to appear on an exam. So this is a situation in which an individual may present with a chief complaint that is not supported by the physical examination or any laboratory workup, any radiographic procedures. When we have a mismatch with regard to what the patient is telling us and what we can find objectively, it becomes a clinical conundrum. So it's very important to make sure that we have a very standard algorithm with regard to how to case formulate these very difficult patients/cases. In this case, the first question to ask is the individual lying? And the answer to that question is always no, unless you uncover evidence to the contrary. So when a nurse leaves the room, goes back in the room, and the patient that had power 0 out of 5 in all extremities is at bedside doing push-ups because they didn't think that they were being observed. At that point, when you get to review the nurse's note, there is evidence that the patient had been untruthful with regard to their chief complaint, with regard to the subjective portion of their SOAP note. So in those cases, we're going to put that on the side burner just for a second. In all other cases, the patient gets the benefit of the doubt. And very high in the differential diagnosis is an illness from a chapter in the DSM referred to as the somatic symptom and related disorders. And with regard to related disorders, the most common that you have to consider is a condition called conversion disorder. So in cases in which the patient's chief complaint, their subjective report and experience, does not match objective findings, we always assume they are not lying. And we always then look at somatic symptom disorder and conversion disorder as two illnesses that are very high in that differential diagnosis. On the other hand, as we continue to go down the algorithm, and in cases in which the patient has been caught on a lie, now we ask the clinical question, why? What is their underlying motivation? If there is clear motivation, if there is clear external incentive uncovered, we call that malingering. We're going to put that on the side burner for a second because that is Kramer. It's in conditions in which that external incentive is not uncovered because, again, we always give the patient the benefit of the doubt. No matter what you think might be motivating the behavior, unless you have clear discovery of that, there is none, right? So in these cases in which there is no clear evidence, we give our patients the benefit and we understand that they are misrepresenting their symptoms, but for reasons that are unconscious or subconscious to them. This is a condition called factitious disorder. All right, and another disorder, by the way, that is actually demonstrated in M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense. So now you have two reasons this weekend to watch that film if you haven't already seen it. Again, we're at a condition here called factitious disorder in which the individual has a mismatch. They actually are lying to your face for reasons that they don't understand or they're not consciously aware of. That's a very, very, very difficult disorder to not only diagnose, but to treat. You can see how tricky that might be. On the other hand, when there is clear incentive that is uncovered, when there's an external incentive, we call it malingering. And now that brings us finally to the character of Kramer here. But much more importantly, in identifying that Kramer is malingering, is how we get there. Okay, and this is an algorithm that we will go through over the next 3.5 weeks of your life. And certainly what you learned during your psych clerkship was going to definitely inform you with regard to your future career, because you will see this. Again, it's going to be a somatic symptom of related disorder, for example, conversion disorder until proven otherwise. Once you actually have evidence that the patient has been deceitful, misrepresenting their symptoms, then it's factitious because we don't understand the motivation. Perhaps we haven't discovered it. Therefore, we continue to give our patient the benefit of the doubt. And then when we do discover that external incentive, then we look at malingering. So there's the algorithm. And in this case, I think Kramer, yes, is malingering. I think there's clear motivation, external motivation, with regard to the payout that the coffee company is going to give with regard to his being tutored by Jackie in the Maestro. All right, we're right at 8:30. I'll take any last questions or comments, observations before we sign off. Any other final thoughts? All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. For those of you who are on, I believe, the red team, I will see you around 9 o'clock for rounds. All right, 9:15. I'll definitely find you when I get there. Everybody have a great morning.